Hello, welcome to this second webinar of our short series about sustainable organisations. Thanks very much for joining. It's great for us to have the opportunity to share some ideas, partly building on some of the ideas from last week, but looking particularly about solutions and alternatives to sustainability problems. My name's Andy Brookes. I'm a senior lecturer in the business school, been teaching here over 10 years. Previously had a career in engineering, industry and various parts of the public sector, but always had an interest in change. And in the last 5 years, been working very closely with my colleague Matthijs, who's been working on this area of sustainability. Just the shape of the session, we're going to do, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, 25-30 minutes, and then we'll open up the session for questions. I'll just let Matthijs into the room just to introduce himself.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthijs. I'm joining online remotely. I'm Professor of Responsible Management at the Business School in the University of Lincoln.
Great. Thanks, Matthijs. Well, one thing we picked up last week was that in all the problems we're currently facing in the world at the moment, many different types of challenges, just carrying on doing what we do now will not fix the problems. And that's becoming more evident as time unfolds. And this is something that's unfolded at an even greater rate in the last week, to show that we're not just dealing with the problems, some of the problems are, if anything, getting worse. So we've got a huge catastrophe unfolding in Pakistan at the moment with the monsoon floods, where the rainfall is, I think, 5 times greater than the average over the last 30 years. And about a third of the country has been subsumed in water. So a major problem, not just damage to the environment, but that has a huge impact on people. So more than 1,000 people have died so far as a result of this flooding. But millions of acres of farmland have been lost. A couple of 100,000 animals have been killed as a result of the flooding. And clearly there's an economic cost as well. So these are huge costs. And this follows on from many parts of the world had extreme heat recently. Pakistan had temperatures over 50 degrees. And I think Pakistan has a higher number of glaciers than a number of countries. So clearly that starts to link into a pattern of high temperatures, high rainfall, and the melting of these glaciers. So we really have a moral duty to do something to solve these problems, to prevent harm to humans and the environment. And we can see from what's happening in Pakistan at the moment, that as we damage the environment, we cause harm to people. The things are totally linked. When we think about sustainability, though, we're thinking more broadly than purely the environment. We're thinking of, clearly, we've talked about the environment, but we're also talking about other social inequalities and damage that we've provided to people's lives and people's opportunities. A couple of examples: 129 million girls thought to be out of school worldwide. So that's a huge detriment to their life chances and a missed opportunity for their education and what they can bring to the world. So clearly that's something that needs addressing. And we saw the fragility of our current system of way of running society, that after 2 years of the pandemic, another 163 million people are estimated to have gone into poverty. So we've got all of these issues that link: health issues, environmental issues, economic issues. Important to think, though, when we think about sustainability, really what we're talking about today is imagining a sustainable future. At the moment, we're living in an unsustainable era, given all these challenges. Sustainability is about dealing with those crises, but actually it's much more about developing a society where humans flourish, where the environment is flourishing and recovering. So it's a very positive outlook about solving today's problems, avoiding the crises, but moving to a point where humanity and the environment is flourishing. But at the heart of that, central to this moving to a sustainable society, central to that is moving to a sustainable economy. Much of the damage we're seeing is a result of economic activity, and increased economic activity. So the biggest part of this imagining a future that we're talking about today, and imagining alternatives, is imagining what a sustainable economy looks like. Because that's key to us dealing with all these issues in the long term. And really, to understand about what sustainable future looks like, it does involve this imagination. If we're going to build sustainable organisations and a sustainable economy, it's about this difficult job of imagining something different. But part of that perhaps starts with thinking about how unsustainable is business as usual. How unsustainable is what we do now. And already people are starting to question what it means, the way we run the economy now, and the basis and structure of that economy. And a very mainstream economist, like Mark Carney, who was the ex-governor of the Bank of England, has already started to look at or question what are the values on which our economy is based. And part of the problems he argues is that we're basing the economy and the way we run society on financial values rather than human values. And he argued in his recent set of lectures that we should be switching round to that. But one of the things we touched on last time, we touched on a number of arguments about how and why it's so difficult to make this transition. And the third one on that list was our difficulty to imagine what this future looks like. And that's what we're trying to tease out today. The business as usual is so dominant, we're surrounded by the business as usual. It's our dominant reality. It's very difficult to imagine something different. But it does start with starting to tease out what is unsustainable about what we do now, as Mark Carney explored. So what does business as usual look like? Why is it unsustainable? But in some ways, it goes back to not just this idea of built on unsound values, it's built on a number of assumptions which have created a great deal of wealth, a great deal of economic activity. But these assumptions are now being shown to be flawed in terms of the damage we're causing to the environment, to society and the economy. And we could actually describe these assumptions in many different ways, but all of them, when we really test them out, actually are unsustainable. Particularly this idea of unlimited growth. Most of the major economies are based on the idea of growth and the quest for growth and the aim to continually grow economies. In some ways that makes no sense. We live on a finite planet with finite resources. Unlimited growth is really an absurdity. It's an impossibility. And the scale of growth we would need to achieve, if we're achieving it all through growth, we need to grow the economy hundreds of times to be able to bring everybody in the world up to a good level of living that we say have in the EU at the moment. So it's the idea of achieving and dealing with these problems through growth is a limited or flawed assumption. We also have an economy based on consumption, which again is counter to sustainability. Sustainability is about sustaining. Consumption is about destruction. So the two are incompatible. We're exploiting and depleting resources, as well as human beings, and probably central to our problems at the moment, our whole economies rely on burning fossil fuels. And we can already see in the current crisis that we've got how central fossil fuels are to our economy, and our reliance on that, and the fragility of our economies because of that. So recently 80% rise in the price of energy in the UK, expected to go further. Part of that is because our economy is based on these particular assumptions: growth, consumption, and the burning of fossil fuels. There's some of the root causes, as well as some of the conflict and war that's going on in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. All related, but but related back to these core assumptions as well. This growth-based paradigm is very limited. This growth-based view of the world is very limited. In some ways, it set out with good intentions. Its idea was, if we grow enough wealth in the world, that will trickle down to the poorer parts of our society, poorer countries in the world. So if we create a big enough pie of wealth, it will trickle down and benefit everyone and improve health and well-being. But that simply hasn't happened. If we look at a simple graph of people's life expectancy versus wealth in the country, you're likely to live half as long if you live in some of these poorer countries. So a difference of 40 to 80 years. Clearly this trickle-down effect is not happening. The same happens in lots of countries where you've got regional variations as well. And this is a paper by Jackson. He says this conventional growth-based paradigm, the evidence just doesn't support it. If anything, inequalities are getting worse, even though wealth at the top of society is getting more. So this growth-based model that will create well-being for society is flawed. What we have to do then is start to imagine and restructure our society. What could this sustainable economy look like? And people are starting to do that. Following the pandemic, the World Health Organization realized the pandemic was so closely linked to economic well-being as well, and health. And really to this extent that it started to do some work to say some of these things about what a sustainable economy is like. What is the purpose of the economy? And a number of people linked to this organisation, academics, people from business and the rest of society, are working on this project through the World Health Organization to look at this, looking quite fundamentally at what is the purpose of the economy. And as it says here, the objective of the economy is to build a healthy societies that are just, inclusive, equitable and sustainable. So rethinking of the purpose of the economy, because the pandemic and the climate change problems that we're seeing are evidence that our economy isn't doing that at the moment. So it's a rethinking of our economy, rethinking of the core purpose. So what will a sustainable economy look like? Well, we need to develop that from now. We need to make the transition to it. But the starting point needs to be of moving away from the current unsustainable assumptions. So all those assumptions that we saw earlier, we can't truly build a sustainable economy if it's based on growth. We can't build it if it's based on consumption. And we clearly can't build a sustainable economy if its assumption is grounded on building fossil fuels. And this transition is now urgently required. We need to be doing that. We need to recognise in this new sustainable economic model that there are limits to growth. There are biological and physical limits to growth. We only inhabit one planet and a finite amount of resource. And in many cases, we've exceeded that. The climate problems we see now are evidence that we've exceeded some of those biophysical boundaries, and the climate has changed. So we need to do something about that. But making this transition is about doing it in a just way as well. We've already just seen on that previous slide how unequal the world is. Just by being born in some of those lower income countries, our life chances are so much diminished. So it would be unfair if the transition to a sustainable economy didn't address that. It didn't recognise that perhaps growth and improving living standards in those countries is a priority to build that back up. So it needs to be done a just transition that benefits all. And we need to build a wider infrastructure to support that as well. We need to think about our laws and our supporting infrastructure, the way we finance. All of those things will provide an ecosystem, if you like, for our sustainable economy. But as we said last week, one of the new lenses we were talking about was looking at sustainability through the organisational lens. The fact that the economy is really made up of lots of organisations and interactions between organisations and institutions. So the challenge for business leaders, organisational decision makers, policy makers is, how do I make the transition in my organisation? How do I become a truly sustainable organisation? And again, it's acknowledging the current unsustainability within our organisations and recognising that. And work is already starting to be done around that. This paper by Brookes and Shaw have identified a set of what they call sustainable business model types. And this is about almost a checklist in some ways. I'm sure it could be written in different ways, but it's a checklist of things that indicate whether a business model is sustainable or not. It matches up with some of the things we've said before, but it gives organisations a chance to look at what they're doing now and really take a hard look and acknowledge which aspects of their way of operating and their business model are currently sustainable. And organisations need to have this as the starting point, so they make the transition from this unsustainability towards sustainability. That will be problematic though. It will be problematic for tobacco companies and oil companies, because if we look at number 4 there, their fundamental basic offering is unhealthy and unsustainable. However green their supply chains are, their fundamental core offering is unsustainable. So they can never be truly sustainable organisations. If we look at some of the solutions, electric vehicles are starting to emerge slowly and still very expensive, but as an alternative to diesel and petrol cars. But when we match up electric cars to that list, they only meet some of the criteria. They still actually exploit natural resources. The manufacture of the batteries actually exploits a number of valuable resources and is detrimental to the environment. Electric cars and the car market is still built on a consumption model. Perhaps if we were building electric cars that lasted 50 years, it might start to be more sustainable. But it's still built on a consumption model where we end up scrapping millions of cars every year. So these sort of tests or these archetypes are useful to hold up as a mirror to our organisations, our sectors, to understand how sustainable are they. But the transition has to be holistic as well. It needs to be every part of the business. It needs to be all aspects of the business, not just a certain cherry picking of perhaps net zero while we still exploit workers in our supply chains. It needs to be holistic. So when we're talking about organisations, and this whole series is about sustainable organisations, we're talking about organisations in the broadest sense. We're talking about not just single organisations, but we're talking about groups of organisations. We're talking about networks, supply chains. We're talking about organisational sectors. And we're talking about some of the institutions and the professions. So that organisational domain in society is very broad and very complex. And the transition will need to happen across the whole of that domain. At individual organisational level, but all these other levels as well. So it adds complexity, but that's the depth of transition that will need to be made. And it will require action at all those levels. So it's about being holistic. And a number of organisations in the UK, for example, have been criticised for offshoring their carbon emissions, presenting themselves as very clean companies, but in effect offshoring their emissions and buying products in from countries which have got high carbon emissions in making those products. So that would not be a fully, genuinely, truly sustainable organisation that was only green in the UK, and it pushed all its carbon emissions out into its supply chain. So it's broad across the whole organisational network. This is going to be challenging, particularly for some sectors. Some of our sectors are particularly unsustainable when we look at those lists. And quite unexpectedly sometimes. Construction is a very high carbon emitting industry, so construction is one of those. But fashion is also one of the most unsustainable sectors. Because it's fashion, it relies on consumption and the turnover of new products. And the amount of waste each year is astronomical. And there's pictures of branded clothes that have never been worn are being dumped in the desert in Chile. Huge areas of just brand new clothes, because those brands are now out of date, and to maintain the standard of the brand, they need to bring out new clothes and destroy the rest. And it suggests here in this article from Greenpeace that it would actually, if we carried on the same, by 2050, the fashion industry would represent about 25% of emissions. So this has to happen organisation by organisation, sector by sector. It has to happen in the profession as well. What does it mean to be a sustainable accountant? What does it mean to be a sustainable human resource professional? So it's about transition across all these sectors and parts of the organisational domain. We chatted last time about this idea of no alternative. The business as usual, our model of growth, consumption, burning of fossil fuels, is so well embedded that it appears to be that there's no alternative. And people that benefit from the current way we run the economy clearly would like to portray that there's no alternative, because there are a lot of winners in the current economy. But really what we're saying is there is an alternative. There are other ways of doing things. There has to be an alternative. Otherwise we'll keep on facing greater and greater problems as we see. And it means thinking about different modes of organising. And people are already starting to look at that. There's already a Wellbeing Alliance that's been looking at a wellbeing economy. Lots of different ways of talking about what the sustainable economy could look like. Lots of different area terminology. Maybe others will emerge. But the wellbeing economy is another way of saying we should run the economy for the well-being of society and individuals. And this group, this organisation is already looking about what's the old way of doing things, what could the new ways of doing things be, and exploring a number of different areas of society and the economy to contrast, well, what would be the old way of doing things and how could we do things differently. And interestingly, it talks about energy generation, and talks about the new way being much more about local energy generation. Part of our assumption about globalisation is we've got a global energy market. So in the UK, we're producing quite low-cost renewable energy, but it has to be sold into the global market and then sold back to consumers at the maximum price. So there's much more a move of saying, well, we need to restructure all of these things and think about better ways of doing it. And localisation and local economies, serving local economies better, is a move forward as well. So there's already moves taking place to imagine what this new economy might look like, what the next stage looks like. And there are alternatives out there. There are alternatives. I think we spoke last time about social enterprises and not-for-profit in the US, worth well over $1 trillion. But the number of cooperatives around the world is astounding. About 250 million people worldwide work in cooperatives. organisations where the benefits are shared and perhaps ploughed back into the community. So there are different ways of doing organisation, different ways of running business that are going to contribute to this sustainable economy. It's already a possibility. And that means every sector, including us in universities, which is partly with what is motivating myself and Matthijs in the project and the work we're doing around sustainable organisations. What does that mean for a transition for universities? What is the role that people that work in universities have? And many people started to write books. This was a book from a couple of years ago called The Good University, thinking about, well, what is the role of the university? What part does it play in making this transition to a fairer, more sustainable society? And that's this work we do at the moment is about that. It's about extending our teaching, but it's about thinking about how universities generate knowledge in a different way, how they work with citizens, students, organisations to develop the new knowledge that's required to bring about this sustainable economy. And so this report, Prosperity Without Growth, has been around about 10 years. So it's not as if a lot of this stuff isn't known. It's not known widely enough, and we haven't started making it happen sufficiently. Which is a little plug for the next seminar in a fortnight, which is about why haven't we made this happen? How can we make it happen? We already know many of the things we should be doing. Why is it not happening? So that's a plug, if you like, an advert for 2 weeks' time. But in this report, it said, a new macroeconomics for sustainability is essential. We can see from the current crises that we're facing that we need a new macroeconomics, but it's also possible. It's happened historically. Economies change and evolve. And we're in a particular phase at the moment that we need to make the transition from. So historically this can happen, but we need to accelerate it. We need to actively engage in that. So thank you for listening to those ideas. If you want a bit more further information, for each of the webinars we're posting a blog on the Business School website. So if you want to read a little bit more detail then, there's a number of resources as well that you can follow and read through. So follow up that blog as well. This is a series of 3 webinars, so there's one in the fortnight to sign up to. The first webinar, if you didn't get a chance to go to that, is available on YouTube now, so you'll be able to find the links to that as well. Something that we've been looking at though is partly in myself and Matthijs' project covers the work we've been doing in terms of our research and engagement. We've also been trying to think, what does this mean for our teaching? What does this mean for the way we change our programs, our education? And we've been working on this new program. It's a brand new MBA program that we're launching in the autumn. And really this program is based on everything that really I've chatted about today, chatted about last week, and will be happening in the next one as well. It's very much about imagining, understanding the problems of sustainability, problematizing and understanding why. It's also about imagining different ways, but it's also about how do we make it happen as well. How do we make this transformation happen? And the whole program is really based around that. It's a very flexible program. It's very much based on looking at these challenges in the world and exploring them in more depth, drawing on a number of disciplines: economics, conventional management, anthropology, psychology, sociology, all of those things, to try and get a deeper understanding of the problems so we can develop some solutions. Very active program where we'll work together as a group to try and develop solutions, perhaps looking at different sectors as a long-term project. It's a 2-year program, and really it follows the phases of what we've been talking about across this work. Problematizing, imagining, creativity, and making a difference with transformation. There's a main website for that programme on the university's website, which gives more details of when the events are. It's a part-time programme. They're 2-day immersive events, almost a conference-style event where we'll look at problems in lots of detail and build that up from there. And really the main benefit for us is partly that we started to change the way we do education so it's aligned with the world's challenges, but also give individuals a benefit that they feel they're making a positive contribution to society at the same time as developing their careers. And it enables organisations to start this transition. This is another means to make the transition to sustainability. Thank you for listening. We're very much open for questions. I'm going to bring Matthijs back into the room. I don't think I've missed anything there, Matthijs. Happy for you to add anything or supplement what we've just said there while I take a slurp of water.
Thank you very much, Andy, for this very interesting opening lecture on imagining alternatives. And as you already indicated earlier, this is a series of 3 lectures, actually. So whereby we discuss the unsustainability of our current models of organizing of the economy, of organizations in the first lecture, and then today is indeed, as you mentioned, about imagining alternatives. And it strikes me that it's immediately quite a big leap. I mean, big leap towards imagining what is not there. So we can observe quite well, and we can try to understand and problematize the existing ways of organizing the economy and the way organizations are structured within our economy and how they are functioning within the economy. But then the question indeed that so often comes up is, okay, but then how could we start to imagine alternatives? How could we even start to think about other ways of organizing? And there's of course the famous saying of Frederick Jameson, at least it's credited to him, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And that, I think, is this enormous obstacle that we are facing in our day and age. And on the other hand, we are also observing quite a lot of initiatives, of course, around alternatives, and that's also interesting to look at. You've mentioned a few, there's many initiatives, including economists who have suggested other ways of organizing the economy, which range from concepts such as the donut economy or the meaning economy, more sustainable, purpose-led economy, economy for the greater good, economy for the common good. So there's a wide range of initiatives that have been developed over the last decades. And I think what they have in common is an idea first that of a problematization and a distancing from the, indeed, as you also mentioned, from the more dominant ways of organizing the contemporary economy, very much growth-based neoliberal economy, and so on, towards an economy, a society that is in principle valuing that's what we share or what is common. So we are perhaps not yet moving towards communism, but more a communist society, as it has been, for instance, mentioned by some scholars. So a valuing of the commons, of common interest, of collaboration, of planetary boundaries, like in Kate Raworth's donut economy, all those. And then so there are some initiatives, and which are interesting, but at the same time we can observe how enormously sticky the capitalism is, our neoliberal capitalist organizing or structuring of the society and economy, and it's quite interesting. I think you've mentioned absurdity, and of course that's also something that we have used as a lens to understand contemporary society and workplaces, and it is in the face of absurdity of our current contemporary predicament that we are still unable to formulate collective responses. So in terms of alternatives. So the question, for instance, long story short, is why haven't we already stepped out of this neoliberal capitalist nightmare into the heaven of the donut economy, or the economy for the common goods, or something like that?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things when you were chatting there, when you were talking about how difficult it is to imagine. I think it was a psychological challenge there in some ways, that we want the certainty of a plan of how to get somewhere, and something about giving us the security of a plan. But in some ways, there isn't. The plan will have to emerge. We'll have to create the plan. We might have a broad idea of what this sustainable economy might look like, but there will never be a definite plan. We have to find a way of getting there in a way that we create the plan as we go along. And I think psychologically that's quite difficult, because we yearn for certainty and we yearn for a plan. That's embedded in our human psychology, which I think is also making it difficult for us to move forward, because we have the certainty of the current day and the current ways of doing things, as opposed to the uncertainty of what the future beneficial possibilities will be. So I think when I was chatting about our programme being multidisciplinary, there's quite a strong psychological aspect to this, because it's about how people make decisions, how people think about things.
Absolutely. By the way, for any of the participants, please, if you want to join the conversation, if you want to add questions, comments, please do put them into the chat. They will arrive on my screen, and I can read them aloud, and we can take them into the discussion. So please do join in with your questions. And in the meantime, while you might be typing a question, we will just continue the conversation. On that note of psychology and the psychology, I think that is also precisely in my own observations of all of these initiatives that I also have mentioned, and being a psychologist myself, it has been indeed striking how usually the psychological elements are somewhat neglected into these theories and ideas for alternative economy. So economists generally tend to portray themselves as being experts of the human mind in their projection of the Homo economicus, the rational human being. But of course have much more difficulty in actually explaining human behavior when it comes to reality on the ground. So in there, and that is also what I've been observing indeed with with these ideas such as the common an economy for the common goods, for instance. So what is the role of an individual on the one hand, but also on the other hand, if we are about to imagine alternatives, what is there then for the individual who is perhaps naturally inclined to cling on to certainties over the uncertainties of radical change, of large mass scale change towards another form of an economy that is not yet predicting. Or at least in capable of ensuring economic stabilities and so on. So the individual then is often neglected, and that is something that we I think we always have to start from. So from the individual human being towards a more societal idea of how would such an economy or society, a sustainable society, look like. But then always returning to the individual. So how then does it look like actually for the individual? What is the role of the individual? How can you actually also live a life, a dignified life, for instance, in a sustainable society, sustainable economy?
Yeah, I think we found that we've done some recent work in a paper around sustainable human resource management. And part of that goes again back to the individual, that it's about how do we change a whole profession in a way? How do we find a way to understand why human resource professionals make decisions and why that particular sector doesn't transform? But there's a psychology there. It's still about individuals in their own organisations trying to influence other people, how they think and how they make decisions. And however much an individual might be committed to sustainability, we've got societal challenges, but there's a societal challenge for each individual in an organisation in trying to change their organisation, because the practices have become deeply institutionalised. The ways of doing things become so much our common practice that it's very hard to change them. So the psychology of bringing about change, again, is complex, but it's important. It explains why we perhaps haven't solved some of these problems to date, because we've overlooked, to a certain extent, some of these psychological aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. It is therefore indeed a matter of this continuous moving between the individual and the collective, and imagine is in that sense not only some kind of way forward, a path forward in terms of how would a more sustainable organization look like, for instance, in a very concrete sense. So, for instance, a sustainable organization that is not purely profit-driven, run basically by shareholders, by CEOs, by profit motives, and so on, towards an organization that systematically, as an organization in its very structuring itself, is aimed at the respecting of the dignity of the people in and outside of the organization, and the dignity of the planet, and of course you mentioned electric cars, and so that's also an interesting example, of course, where we could think, okay, on the one hand, the use of electricity to run our cars is at least means a reduction of oil use, but at the same time, the production of the car itself, and of course the consumption-based logic behind it, in the sense that what you often see is that people sell their cars and buy a new electric car, and feel themselves quite proud to drive an electric car. But in that sense, the consumption-based logic is still very much integrated in those ideas. So The question then is indeed how can we how can we start to formulate the sustainable organization? So in the sense of how could we think about different type of structuring? Now, of course, what we, for instance, one example here, what we of course see is that the neoliberal capitalist logic behind the structuring of the economy, but also behind the structuring of organization, is very much a top-down hierarchical type of structuring. So that where we very much related to what we also saw in for instance in China, where over time with Deng Xiaoping, it was shown how capitalism worked quite well with the authoritarian government. And so in that sense, the marriage of capitalism with authoritarianism at governmental level, at country level, has been debated. But at the same time, of course, we should be aware that in organizational life, this is very much the default mode, right? So the top-down structuring of organization with a small group of board of directors, CEOs, and so on, who basically determine very much the structure and functioning of the organization. But so in that sense, and that is also something that has been discussed often, is the need for more democracy within organizations. And I think that there is a literature, there is a tradition of organizational democracy, workplace democracy, which has been going on for decades now, but which is also still playing out in the margins of organizational life. And that's something that I think we can bring much more forward in our, not just in our program, but generally within the project. But returning then to my original point where I started, the individual. Then something that also is absent in this, for instance, in this literature around organizational democracy, is the role and the position, and in that sense, the psychology of the individual. So I think we also have to be working and thinking and imagining also the role of the individual in this transformation process, and in that sense theorize on the psychology of the individual psychology of the sustainable organization. So not just how is the organizational or the sustainable organization structured and so on, but also what is the role of the individual. How can we make sure that there is this level of certainty, as you already mentioned, so this quite natural inclination to avoid change in the individual, towards the maintenance of stability, even stability if it's detrimental stability over the unpredictability of change. All right, that we see also very much playing out now with climate change, that we rather maintain our position, even though the world is literally burning around us or flooding as is happening in Pakistan, than to engage in radical change, which is ultimately very much a case of deep insecurity.
Do you think you mentioned earlier about hierarchy, which is many of our economic structures based on hierarchy, and in some ways that's created, even personally I can see this aspect, that it gives us across society a sense of powerlessness in some way, in our organisations as well, that we have to wait till somebody at the top whether it's in a government or organisation, makes the decision or decides on the strategy. And in some ways, the vast majority of citizens are waiting for their governments to do something.
Yeah.
And that happens in organisations as well. Many people are very committed, I think, and very genuinely have integrity about doing things in a better way, but they feel disempowered. The way we do organising at the moment tends to disempower people. People tend to wait for something to flow down from the top. And I think this lens of organisations that we've been trying to look at is perhaps thinking about, well, we maybe need to think differently about that, different ways of organising that empower people, that show that they're not powerless. They don't just have to wait. I don't have to wait just as a citizen to start making things happen, whether it's something like this in my professional career or elsewhere. So I think there's definitely something about what we're exploring is taking this link back to practical action, that this transition will need to happen at so many different levels. And at the moment, that's being stifled by this hierarchy, that change can happen at all those levels. And historically, that's how change, whether it was bringing about the abolition of slavery, it happened by individuals persuading others, presenting the information, getting the message out there, creating the social movement. All of those things showed that meaningful change in the past has happened with individuals and by individuals, perhaps despite the hierarchy and despite people in power. It gained such a momentum that change happened. So I think we'll probably explore this more next time, but how can this change happen? What are the barriers? What are the models in what can we learn from history about the way society changes? That gives us the means and the hope that we can actually change and transform out of this current era now.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely so. Yeah. Thank you very much, Andy, for your talk. There were no questions coming in from the audience, so I think it's a nice ending to, and let's wrap up. Perhaps you might want to say something about next week's session.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthijs. Thanks for just curating that part of the session. The next of these webinars is in 2 weeks' time, September the 13th, same time. But we're doing almost the next phase, really. We've just started talking about why hasn't change happened, why is it so difficult to make it happen. I'm really going to start exploring that. One of the elements to our project and our programme is bringing in this multidisciplinary perspective. And in some ways, climate change is a political problem. The changing of organisations is much of it is a political problem. Who and how we make decisions, who is in a position to make decisions, how do we influence decisions? And change is very much about decision making and access and influence of decisions. So very much next time we'll be looking at why has it been so difficult, but linking that again to practical steps. What can we do as individuals, professionals in any organisation, in any sort of work that we do? How can we make a change in a practical way? So I'll draw things to a close. Thank you for joining today, whether you're watching live or by YouTube. Thanks for joining. We'd be very happy to carry on the conversation. So do look up mine and Matthijs' contact details through University of Lincoln contact directory. Drop us an email. Very happy to follow up with the chat. Do take a look at the other webinar and the blogs that we've done. And if you get a chance as well, have a look at our brand new MBA programme as well. Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining.